understand now how the au pair programs work and if there are any measures in place to assist the family of Ms. Tshabalala. And I'm joined now by Kim Gnodde. She is the co-owner of Little Sunshine's au pair agency. She talks to us from Cape Town this evening. Kim, good evening to you. Thank you very much for your time. Before we get into the intricacies of contracts, contractual agreements when it comes to this space, can I find out first from you whether the agency that assisted Ms. Tshabalala to get the initial job in the United States, does that agency have any responsibility in helping her family to facilitate her repatriation from the United States?
So, to put it into perspective, the first thing I would say is that in order for her to have gotten overseas, she would have had to have obtained the J1 visa. And in order to obtain that, you have to go through all sorts of things in terms of documentation and things like that.
Yeah.
But it also includes to have travel insurance. And if one has travel insurance, then technically repatriation should be covered in that. However, and this is where it comes down for me, it's the agency terms and conditions.
Yeah.
And what I would say is basically, I don't know the agency that was involved in this. I don't know what the agency terms are. But the bottom line for me would be that any candidate who's ever going to go overseas, the first thing that I recommend they look at are the agency terms. And things like, you know, what happens in the event that I get sick? What happens in the event that the family doesn't like me and they don't want me to work for them anymore? Can you guarantee that I get another position with a family? All these sorts of things are what candidates should be asking the agencies that they are going with in order to make sure that these answers are, you know, acceptable for them in the event that they go overseas and that they are covered and that situations like this don't happen. Because the costs, as you can see, are exorbitant to bring her back now. And, you know, it's, so it does boil down to the agency terms, but I do find it quite strange because a travel visa, the J1 visa requires that sort of documentation. Yeah. So technically, the agency should have that covered.
And you raise very interesting questions.
It should be part of it.
Yeah, these are the kinds of questions that Tobile Tshabalala's family should be asking of that agency. When it comes to the travel insurance, Kim, I'm reading an article here, and I just want to extrapolate that part which makes reference to the health insurance that she ought to have had. The family is saying, and I quote now, "What scares us most is that the hospital will be releasing her body on Thursday and no mortuary is willing to take her since her health insurance was no longer active after the agency let her go." So there clearly was no longer a contract that existed between herself and the agency that initially helped facilitate her work in the United States. Does that make sense to you?
So to be honest, I'm just going to give a tiny bit of background how it generally works, is that a candidate usually gets a 2-year visa to go to the US. Okay, we're talking the US in specific now. And what will happen, the family will match with a candidate through the agency, and the candidate will then go overseas and work with the agency. Sometimes you get situations where the match is not okay for either party, and then the situation comes where in the interim period, the agency is supposed to find another family for the candidate to work in the US because she's been granted that 2-year visa to au pair. Now,
so just pause there for a moment, Kim. Sorry, I'm interrupting. So you're saying that if there is a mismatch, in other words, the family that she's currently working for no longer likes her or she's fallen out with them, that same agency, it is their responsibility to place her with another family. Is that what you're saying?
Generally speaking, yes. So there are stories, sadly, in the industry where candidates will go, for example, to a family and the family abuses the candidate. It does happen. And obviously in that situation, how can an agency recommend that the candidate stays with the family who's busy abusing her? Okay, her safety comes into question then. So the reality is that, yes, she should be placed with another family. The only issue is that nobody can guarantee that another family will take her on. It's a matching situation. And unfortunately, and this is what we say to our candidates, as much as we try and say that we will place you, there is never a guarantee in terms of placement. And I think this is where the issue came in on her side, is that the one family didn't work out and she was in transition perhaps for another family. The agency didn't match her with another family. And in that period, that's when, from my understanding, she fell ill and she passed away. And this is where I think the grey area is now coming in. But in my opinion, again, I can't stress enough that in order to obtain the visa to go overseas, one has to have the paperwork in place. The agency is responsible for the paperwork. That is pretty much why a host family uses an agency and why a candidate uses an agency, because the agency is supposed to have all this knowledge. That's the purpose of them. If not, the candidates and the families could try it on their own, where some do. But the reality is, if you're going through a registered agency, and please note, the US, in order to have a correct visa, you have to use a US designated au pair agency in order to obtain that visa. So the agency that was used in this case are technically on that database, and they should have all the checks and balances in place. And in the event that something like this happens, it's covered. My only concern is here that, you know, she fell ill and she passed away, and that is not technically exactly what travel insurance is for, to cover things like medical and, in this case, you know, passing away. So again, I would say the travel insurance and the medical insurance should be there for this. That's the purpose of it, unless it wasn't obtained. And if that's the case, then there's a big concern, because that documentation should exist. That's the agency's responsibility.
Kim, you've helped a great deal in clearing up some of the issues here, and perhaps this family, therefore, has lots of questions to ask of the agency that initially placed her there. But yeah, it's quite a grey area. But thank you for clarifying some of these issues for us. Hopefully we can call on you again for further clarification should there need be. Thank you very much for the time being. Kim Gnodde, she is the co-owner of Little Sunshine's Au Pair Agency. She's talking to us from Cape Town.